Welcome to another episode of It Takes a Viking, the official podcast of the Salem State University Alumni and Friends community. My name is Mike Mitchell, Associate Director of Alumni Relations. Very excited to welcome a 2005 graduate from Salem State, adjunct faculty member in the Art and Design Department here at Salem State, in the class of 2005, Emily Dumas. Emily,
Thank you.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How are you?
Thanks for having me. Good. How are you?
Good. You, I think, you're our first art and design graduate.
Really?
Yeah. So we're going to dive into kind of what you've been up to,
all right,
and what life has looked like for you since graduation. But the first question we always ask is, what brought you to Salem State and how did you end up here?
What brought me to Salem State? As a teacher, as a faculty member, or just in general? As a student. Oh, okay. I'll be blunt. My parents were like, you're going to go to state school. If you go to a state school, you live at home, we'll pay for school. I said, okay. So I looked at a couple other schools in the area, and I ironically did not know that I wanted to do art and design. Like, I'd always done art in high school, but I had this weird, well, if I do graphic design, I don't know how to do graphics on a computer. So I was a little hesitant to pick a school where I was going to dive into that. When I could come here, I could be undeclared and then decide that I wanted to do that. So that was also another reason. I could go undeclared, take an art class, and then work my way into the major.
So you get into the major. And
yes.
You graduate in 2005. Talk a little bit about kind of what life looked like for you those next years out of college.
So I took some time off between graduation and looking for a job. I think I was just exhausted from working in school, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So I stumbled upon a job fair in Fenway, at Fenway Park. Defined nothing that made sense for me. I talked to one woman at the Boston Globe. Now, this is ironic because nowadays everything's social media, email. Back then, you had to meet people and get a name and get an email. You couldn't just look it up.
Network.
So I had gone to this job fair thinking I can't leave here without talking to at least one person, because it was all like pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies, things of that nature. So I found someone at the Boston Globe, gave her my resume, gave her my little leave behind. And she graciously liked it and was like, hey, why don't you contact these people at these agencies? And I'm like, okay. So from there, basically landed me into my first job out of school, which was an intern at a large ad agency in Boston that still exists, Hill Holiday. I have to call them out because they taught me everything I know. So I started working there as a designer / art director. I stayed there for about 7 years before I ventured onto my own.
And now, what did the next steps in venturing onto your own? And we'll get into this a little bit more in depth later on. But when you say venturing out on your own, what did that look like?
So I was kind of tired because I worked a lot. Advertising at the time, it's evolved because people are much more in line with working from home and work-life balance. Mm-hmm. That didn't exist as much as it does today. So I was working a lot and just kind of got burnt out. And I'd always wanted to venture out on my own because I had started, while I was working at Hill Holiday, I started my own line of stationery products. I was doing wedding invitations and sort of designs for people, creating cards and prints and all of these things, just as a side gig. I would do craft fairs and Etsy and all that stuff. And I really enjoyed doing that and thought, I wonder if I could leave this 9 to 5 freelance and then maybe start to pick up this business. I didn't know how or I was going to achieve that. But I knew enough people in the industry to get me kind of referrals. And I knew a lot of people from Salem State that I could network with to try to get that work. So I started doing that.
And I think that's always kind of one of the questions that budding entrepreneurs will ask themselves is that, can I do this? Yes. But then you go, well, how do I do this?
Yeah.
So there's a whole other
trial and error.
Yeah, there's a whole other side to it. And that kind of leads to what one of the things that I love the most about your work is that I've probably passed it in stores hundreds of times and never known it was yours.
Mm-hmm.
One of I think the things that I love the most about your work is it's fun, right? It's catchy phrases and just all the kind of kitschy things that are super popular right now. And I love that. I think they're so much fun. But if, you mentioned your design projects and your stationery and things like that, where can some of your work be found right now?
So now, so since I evolved from I was creating my own products for a long time. So I was creating the art that went into the products, but I was also literally printing, cutting, folding,
So you were
making
into it for
everything
all
by
that side
hand.
too.
Yeah. So it
Okay.
was like the art perspective, but it was also like the handmade, because handmade sort of market was huge back then, where Etsy was blowing up and all that. So at a point, again, I hit a wall where I'm like, I feel like I'm just making cards all day, and I just want to focus on making the art. So that is where I transitioned into finding a way to do that. Like, there's got to be a way. There's like, I see this stuff in stores, and they're not making the product, somebody else is. So I educated myself on that. So now, yeah, that's led me to a place where I create the art, but I don't worry about the product. I just worry about the art, and somebody else worries about the product. So those products range from greeting cards, all the things that I was making on my own, greeting cards, wall art, so something you might hang on the wall, fabric, mugs, any little sort of accessories, trinkets, gifts. Typically, I'm in TJ Maxx, Home Goods, Marshalls, but I've been in Walmart, Target, Trader Joe's, Staples, pretty much any like major retailer that sells products of that nature.
So that's going down like the licensing route then for your work.
Correct.
Right? So
yep.
how did that whole idea come about in terms of you saying, I've got something here, but I think it's probably better suited for me to just take care of the design and let somebody else, like how did some of those original conversations happen with places like the TJXs of the world?
Sure. So when I was making my own products, like I said, I felt like that's what I was doing. And that requires also anyone that's into like product making, even if you're creating t-shirts or whatever, you have to house that inventory. You need to keep it somewhere.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of money. You don't know if it's going to sell. So there's a lot of risks in there. And maybe we'll talk about this later. Maybe we won't, but perhaps I, made a lot of mistakes in that area too, which kind of led me here. I'm like, I'm spending all this money. I have all this inventory. So it kind of just led me to doing my own research and finding out, like, is this a thing? Does this exist? So I stumbled upon an online course, which also at the time, this was like 2007 maybe. Online learning now has exploded.
Huge.
So this was like kind of the first of its kind in what we'll call licensing. So I found a course that taught artists how to think about their work for product. And so that was, I didn't even really know it existed before I found it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I found it and thought, the light bulb went off, and I thought, so, okay, this is the way in which I get rid of making products, and hopefully somebody else can do it. So I started on my own. I just started doing it myself. I started treating my work as, I'd licensed the art. So somebody essentially borrows it to use it for a certain amount of time, as opposed to just selling the product itself. So I sort of dabbled in, the client asked me to do something, I'd approach it that way. So I learned a little bit on my own, which eventually led me to somebody that now actually helps me to find those clients.
Okay.
So I now work with what's called an art agent, for lack of a better term, or a licensing agent that essentially works with the manufacturers to make the products. So I just focus on the art. She helps me facilitate those relationships. And when the two to come together, that's how it works.
And you're not stuck with boxes of t-shirts
Correct.
and pads and things like that.
TJ Maxx is stuck with it. Yeah, yes,
somebody
exactly.
else deal with it. Smart.
Yes,
smart.
exactly.
When was it? So really quickly too, you had mentioned you essentially let a company borrow your art.
Correct.
So you retain the trademarks and
yes.
the intellectual property rights
yes.
and stuff?
Okay. So it sort of works. The best way to explain it to people that don't quite understand is like Disney, for example. Think of all the products that Disney's on, or Marvel, like a t-shirt, kids bedding, plushies, like they are not actually making those products. Whoever is the manufacturer of the product is making it. So Disney and Marvel say, hey, you have a license to use our art on these certain products. Same thing with music. If you see a song in a commercial, that artist or band has said, hey, Chevy, you can use our song for your commercial. So it's a certain amount of time for a specific thing. Yes, generally the artist retains copyright. There are instances where they may not. But I do, yes. So I retain copyright for these companies, manufacturers, to use my art and product. Okay. Because it's not for forever, it's temporary, right? So it might be in a store for a season. By next season, they want something different. So it's pretty short-lived.
Part of, so in working with your agent, does that come up? Where is your agent saying, some retailers are looking for things along these lines? Do you change the theme of your designs depending on what's happening?
Yes. So we get something called trend reports. Trickles all the way down from high-end fashion, really, or pop culture, or whatever is trending right now. like the cowboy aesthetic thing is still heavily influenced by what's it, Yellowstone,
Yeah.
and then also Taylor and Beyonce, and that whole thing.
Country's hot.
Yeah, so that trickles down eventually to Dollar Tree and TJ Maxx, and consumers wanting that stuff on everything. So we kind of get these trend reports that say like Christmas this year is going to be plaid and red trucks.
Yeah.
And as an artist, I can decide, do I want to actually do this, or do I want to skip this trend? Because there's lots of them. So I think I ultimately decide like what things work for my work, what speaks to me, what I think will be fun, and I go from there.
And in talking about things that speak to you, you are now an adjunct professor here, and
Yes.
also at another school as well.
Yes.
Okay. Very
yes.
good. So when did the idea to kind of transition into teaching come up, and what made you have that moment of saying, I think I want to dip my toe in this water and see how it goes?
Yeah. So ever since I graduated, I made a point to stay in touch with my professors, and like, I think I pretty much came back every semester for either portfolio reviews or to speak to the class about what I did. This was when I worked in advertising prior to going out on my own. And that was just important to me to like give back to where I came from and try to help students, see that this path is accessible. And I just always voiced my opinion that I had interest in teaching. And to be honest, it just kind of happened. Like it was almost like an emergency situation. They really needed someone to teach a class.
Mm-hmm.
And they reached out to me, and that's when it started.
And when did you start teaching here?
2011.
Wow, so it's been a while.
Been a while.
13 years. Is this
been
your 13th
a while, or is it
year?
20? No, 2013. I lied. 2013.
Still 10 years.
Yep.
That's a good long time.
Yep.
So you just mentioned this, and when you would first come out of undergrad, you would come back and talk to students about things to consider and how to navigate the path. And I think probably one of the things that you'll see now, given that you started your teaching career fairly close to when you completed your undergraduate career, it was only 7 or 8 years later.
Yeah.
Do you find that the advice that you're giving now as a teacher versus when you were a young graduate out in the industry, kind of solely away from teaching, is the advice the same? Are you offering anything different in what you're telling students now that might be interested in doing what you do?
That's a good question. I think it is different. Because there obviously are some principal things that are the same, right? Like I always tell my students, if you're going to an interview in person, like don't be on your phone. You don't know who's going to walk by. You don't know, is that your future boss? Is that the owner of the company? Like be present, so those sorts of things. Yeah, I think are important. So that stuff doesn't change, but the technology's changed. The competition has changed. The speed at which you need to know things and what you're expected to know has changed. So I think in that regard, the advice I give is different. But I think sort of like the principal things of just like being, present in the moment or paying attention, I guess, to your surroundings are the same.
Do you find, and I'm sure you do, we had spoken with a graduate last year, a guy named John Salemi, who says that, the role that AI plays in his work in terms of getting scripts started and things like that.
Sure.
Do you find a competitive challenge with artificial intelligence in the work that you do, or is it because your work is fairly so specific that it's not necessarily something that you have to think about or worry about?
I think about it sometimes. Like, in fact, I've used it to like help me come up with ideas if I'm stuck. But yeah, I don't think it's so much integrate. It's funny because I actually think there's programs like Photoshop, for example. To me, I'm like, AI has always been integrated in some way. Like you can always, select an area and add something to it or expand it. It's just more advanced now. So like we've always sort of been using these tools to help us create things. But yeah, for me specifically in what I'm doing right now, as far as licensing and product design, I haven't really had to think about it in that way, but I do think for like graphic designers, it's probably a different answer. Yeah.
I mean, you see so much on social media with, filters on TikTok and different aesthetics that they can provide, and
Snapchat.
They can make, Frank Sinatra sing "Happy Birthday."
Sure.
So it's really incredible what it's capable of, but also seeing the pluses and minuses that it can add to kind of folks' daily life is. Yeah. It's going to be different for everybody depending on the kind of work you do, obviously. But
it's hard as a teacher, mentor, educator to define that line too, because it's hard to tell students like you can't utilize this because they're going to, and they're going to need to, and they should see what it's capable of doing. So I often have trouble with that because I think there's a lot of educators who are hard way one or the other, but creative people, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of creative people that are just like absolutely not, and I'm like, well, you know, just a part of our reality now. So at some point you have to integrate it. Away. Yeah.
I don't use it very much for what we do, and I had an experience where I said, let me give it a shot. So I told Chat GPT to show me a picture of a Pokemon playing volleyball, a specific Pokemon.
Okay.
And it was like, well, this is a licensed character, so I can't show you that, but I can show you a design that's very similar to it with a yellow character with a lightning bolt tail playing volleyball. And I went, I'm a little bit terrified of this app.
I mean, that's ethical, I suppose, for AI.
Yeah, it was somewhat admirable, but like the intuitiveness that it had to say, well, actually, that's a copywritten character, so I can't do that one.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, though. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but there's a lot of talk about it now because there are a lot of rules and laws in place, particularly for creatives. I mean, there are people simulating, musical artists, like that's their brand and their name. And so how do we define like how we use it? So it's interesting that it responded that way. So maybe the tables are like turning into being like, hey,
hopefully there's more responsibility.
I hope so. That's like the one thing to me, because you think about that as an artist, like for someone like me, I worked so hard to build what I have. Like I really think about that. Like I am my own brand and I have my own look and feel. And for someone just so easily to come in and like try to tarnish that is really like disheartening, So.
And speaking of building your own brand, you have a terrific Instagram page.
Thanks.
I love your social accounts. If you want to follow along, where can we find you on Instagram?
Emily Dumas Illustration is my handle. I don't do TikTok because I'm too old, but I do Instagram. Yes.
So Instagram, we talk anywhere about kind of your process in the licensing world, teaching, but just you're out and about in the community, kind of doing your thing out there. So I would certainly recommend following along. It's always good stuff. I mean, we were talking before we started this recording about concerts that we've seen and things like that as well. So follow along on Instagram there.
I try to be my just authentic self. A lot of people take social media really seriously. And I'm just like, we don't have to do that,
They could remember back to the days of what it was when it first started, when we were an undergraduate.
Oh my gosh. Yeah,
right. The walls on Facebook, and
it's either overproduced or chaos, So I'm like, just be yourself. And if like everyone's also afraid of who's going to like me, and I'm not really concerned about that. I'm not for everyone, and not everyone's for me, and that's okay.
All right. And your Instagram also has your website on it too, right?
Yes.
And we'll put that on the video as well for people that may want to visit your website. And you've got a shop there, so you can pick up some print products and things like that. It's awesome work. We've gotten some in the past for like the May 4th Star Wars stuff, the posters that you've done there.
I have some more of those. I'll have to give them to you.
So last question I'd love to ask you, and you've kind of touched on this already a little bit, but as someone who stayed connected, why is it important to you to be a member of the Salem State community, and what does it mean to you?
I always say to my peers or anyone that's taught in higher ed, there's something special about the students at Salem State. Like there's a humility about them. A lot of them, first generation college students, are paying for school, have full-time jobs, are caring for a parent, a child. Other students in other schools don't do that. And they show up and do the work. It's actually pretty unbelievable. So I think for me, it's always been like, I was that way when I was a student. I went to school full-time, I worked full-time, I had 2 internships. And that's just like the nature of the Salem State student. And I think that's why they get hired, quite frankly. Even coming from an art profession, I tell my students, it's not always about the work. It's about like your, how you present yourself, your work ethic, and that sort of thing. And I just think when people see Salem State, they're like, that's a hardworking individual. And so that's like, to me, it's important to come from that, as opposed to maybe a more prestigious university where it's like name dropping or knowing somebody really important. Salem, they just get behind people because they know they can do the work. And I think that's important.
And I don't think I could have done it better. That was well done. So, Emily, really appreciate your time. Thank
Yeah,
you so
thank
much for
you.
joining us, sharing your insights and your story. I want to thank everybody for watching along. It's been another episode of It Takes a Viking, the official podcast of the Salem State University Alumni and Friends community. My name is Mike Mitchell, and until next time, thanks for watching.